Hello, this is Dr. Martin Lewison, Farmingdale State College, and I'm going to discuss a brief history of SeaWorld, brief corporate history of SeaWorld, that is. SeaWorld is listed on the New York Stock Exchange. The symbol is SEAS, S-E-A-S. First, there are the three SeaWorld parks, one in San Diego, one in San Antonio, Texas, and one in Orlando, Florida, and each of those has an Aquatica water park. Although the SeaWorld, the Aquatica in San Diego, is being converted to a Sesame Place standalone children's park, but the Orlando and San Antonio Aquatica parks remain water parks. There's also Busch Gardens. There are two Busch Gardens parks, one in Tampa, Florida, the other in Williamsburg, Virginia. There is also Sesame Place, so there will be a second Sesame Place in San Diego when they convert Aquatica. Sesame Place is outside of Philadelphia in Langhorne, Pennsylvania. It's a children's park. There are rides, although there's not much there. Like I said, it's a children's park. But it's really expensive for adults because they charge the adults a lot, and I don't think they charge the children so much. I've really only gone in for the roller coasters, and I haven't seen much else there. I guess there are shows or something. I'm not sure. I should take a longer look the next time I'm there. There's also a boutique park called Discovery Cove in Orlando. I'll talk about that a little later. It's a park where you swim with the dolphins. They have a similar sort of park in San Antonio in Texas. But it's not a full park. I think it's just a cutout of the SeaWorld park. That's something I need to investigate. SeaWorld also owns Water Country USA, a water park in Williamsburg, Virginia, as well as Adventure Island Water Park in Tampa, Florida, sort of a standalone there. Now, to talk about the history of SeaWorld, the corporate history of SeaWorld, we have to obviously include the longer history of Busch Gardens. Not much longer, but fairly longer. Busch Gardens was a separate pair of theme parks that was merged with the SeaWorld parks. I'll explain as we go ahead. The original Busch Gardens had been founded in Pasadena, California by Adolphus Busch. I believe he was a grandson of the founders of Anheuser-Busch, the brewery in St. Louis, Missouri. And of course they were very wealthy. By the 20th century, they were quite wealthy, the Busch family. And he built gardens in Pasadena and made them open to the public between 1909 and 1937. And if you look, you can see that even though that area was torn down and the gardens are no longer there, I believe this is residential housing, you can see that the street names are still named after Busch Gardens, Busch Place, Busch Gardens Drive, Busch Gardens Court, and this is in Pasadena, which is, of course, part of Los Angeles. So the first Busch Gardens traditional theme park, as it were, was opened in 1959, and this was an add-on to the Anheuser-Busch Brewery Tour in Tampa, Florida. And in 1959, the Anheuser-Busch added on gardens for the public to visit and a bird sanctuary. So this was all added to a brewery tour that was available for visitors. There wasn't tourism in Florida had not yet hit its stride. So this is quite early in the history of Florida tourism for this kind of major tourist attraction. There were a few others, but this is notable. That park grew into a real theme park called Busch Gardens, well, it's gone through several names. Uh, One of them was Busch Gardens The Dark Continent. The name of the park has usually, if it hasn't reflected Tampa, it's reflected Africa. So, and the park has always had sort of a cross identity between a theme park and an animal park. So there's quite a large zoo at Busch Gardens in Tampa. So it's gone through a bunch of different names. Like I said, it's part animal park and part theme park or part thrill park. And these parks are very nice parks. That they also have their legacy as gardens, so they're quite beautiful and landscaped very nicely. The first name was Busch Gardens The Dark Continent. Then it became known as Busch Gardens Tampa, then Busch Gardens Africa, and most recently it's called Busch Gardens Tampa again. But you will see a good deal of Africa theming, and both for the zoo areas and for the rides. And you can see this is just a photo of a relatively recent roller coaster addition to Busch Gardens Tampa. Cobra's Curse, built by Mach Rides, the German manufacturer. And I don't know if you can see this, but you get in the train and then you're actually brought up by an elevator, and then the train goes down the track. So there's no lift hill. You're actually brought up by an elevator, which is kind of interesting. All right, so that's one Busch Gardens in Tampa. The other Busch Gardens is in Williamsburg, Virginia. Now, Williamsburg, Virginia was already a destination when Busch Gardens decided to build a theme park there. Williamsburg is of historic interest because it was the colonial capital of Virginia back in the 17th century and 18th century. And in fact, it was it was the colonial capital of Virginia, and wasn't moved. The colonial capital wasn't moved until the War of Independence in 1780. The seat of government was moved to the current state capital, which is Richmond. Richmond was more central within the state of Virginia. It was more difficult for the British to attack, and it had better connections with the western parts of the state. The town Williamsburg, after the capital was moved out, sort of became a sleepy, forgotten place, and was essentially ignored during the Civil War. And the result was that much of its 17th and 18th century, or 19th, mostly 18th century architecture survived. And this was sort of discovered in the early 20th century, that these colonial buildings were still standing in good shape. And so restoration efforts began in the early 20th century, and they raised a lot of money to restore the town. And John D. Rockefeller Jr., the son of John D. Rockefeller, of course, the oil baron, John D. Rockefeller Jr., he became associated with the project, donated enormous amounts of wealth. So today it is a living museum and a historic area. And I should also mention that Williamsburg is also the home of William and Mary College, which is I think it's the second oldest college in the United States after Harvard. And Thomas Jefferson went to college at William and Mary in Williamsburg. So Anheuser-Busch builds a brewery in Williamsburg in 1972, and they do the whole thing again with brewery tours and so forth. And they open a theme park in 1975 called The Old Country at Busch Gardens, and this time the theming will be European, as opposed to Africa in Tampa. This is actually a photo from opening day, and I believe this is the governor of Virginia and he's sitting with, I believe this is the wife of August Bush III, who was who became probably the most powerful leader in the Bush family of Anheuser-Busch, the company, during the 20th century. So that's it for the Busch Gardens part of SeaWorld. Let's go back to SeaWorld proper. The original concept for SeaWorld was actually for a restaurant where you would sort of be submerged in the water. And it was founded by four friends from UCLA. And one of these friends actually became quite a name in the theme park industry. I'm going to bring you this link to a book about him on Amazon.com, The Wavemaker. So this was George Millay, and George Millay was a creator of SeaWorld. He also helped to found and build Magic Mountain, which is the Six Flags park in the Los Angeles area. And if I'm not mistaken, Six Flags Magic Mountain has more roller. It is literally the roller coaster capital of the world, in that it has more roller coasters than any other park at the moment. And Millay also really created the modern. Millay also created the modern water park industry when he founded a chain called Wet n Wild. These four friends decided to develop this restaurant concept, but they thought about it and it was a bit impractical. They were influenced by earlier marine parks that had begun, but aquariums were not, that big of they weren't that huge in the 60s, although there were aquariums around. The New York Aquarium is the oldest aquarium in the United States and actually started in 1896. It was actually in Manhattan at Battery Park. If you're ever down there and you see that big circular building down there, that actually was the New York Aquarium. But in the 50s, Robert Moses, who was the parks commissioner, moved the aquarium to Coney Island in Brooklyn. There were others that influenced them. Marine Studios in Jacksonville, Florida, had trained dolphins. The Miami Seaquarium was founded in 1955 and also had trained cetaceans. And finally, Marineland of the Pacific in Los Angeles, which probably was the closest and had the most influence on these friends, they had the first captured pilot whale and the first marine kind of scripted shows for visitors to the marine park. So the idea of the restaurant changed to that of an oceanarium. I don't know how that's different from an aquarium, but that's the word they used. Of course, back in this period in the 60s, California is growing extremely rapidly, right? This is all of the New York baseball teams are moving to California and things like that. And so it seemed like a good investment to build such a large, a large kind of visitor attraction. Of course, Walt Disneyland had opened less than a decade earlier. So people were convinced around this time that things like theme parks or visitor attractions were a good investment. And they put forward a plan to the city of New York for some land by Mission Bay in San Diego. And the plan was approved by the city. And SeaWorld opens in 1964 in March. And here are some original 1964 souvenirs, souvenir plate and cup, and you can see some of these things like the Sky Ride. It's still there, and these kind of aerial shows with performers still there. That stuff's still there. The owners eventually sold out to fund expansion, so they were no longer majority owners. It became a publicly traded company in 1968, 4 years later, when they first issued public stock. Now, the second SeaWorld location was sort of in the least place you'd expect it. It was in Ohio. And yeah, it still seems sort of like an odd choice, but they did the work and decided that Aurora, Ohio was a good place to have a tourist attraction, even though it didn't make a lot of sense to have a marine park in a cold water climate, but they did it anyway. SeaWorld of Ohio opened in 1970. Already in that location was an old theme park called Geauga Lake. So Geauga Lake was actually one of these 19th century pleasure beaches, and I forgot the name. I guess it's Geauga Lake. Yeah, that's it. Geauga Lake in Aurora, Ohio, had been attracting summer pleasure seekers for nearly 100 years, and SeaWorld set up just across the lake from the Geauga Lake amusement park. So there was an amusement park, there was a water park, and SeaWorld builds this marine park across the lake. Now, for a while at least, SeaWorld, they were allowed to build there with the agreement that they weren't allowed to build any sorts of amusement rides. So that did kind of dog the location because it probably depressed the location's attendance because of all the SeaWorlds. It was the one that didn't have rides. I visited there once. There were no rides. But in the future, one company did end up buying the entire area, so they own Geauga Lake and SeaWorld. But anyway, that's for the future, and actually that company turned out to be Six Flags ultimately. Okay, but this is not a corporate history of Six Flags; it's a corporate history of SeaWorld. As I said, I visited SeaWorld Ohio in the 90s, not too long before it closed, and I was impressed by the place. It was beautiful, it was gorgeous, it was manicured, the shows were wonderful, it was a really nice place. It was also, as I recall, insanely expensive, certainly for me because I was a graduate student, not earning a lot of money. Now, it's worth noting that a couple of years after SeaWorld Ohio opened, the United States passed what's called the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And what this did was it made it illegal to capture killer whales in the wild. And this didn't stop killer whale hunting. Killer whale hunting continues to this day, just not in the United States. Japan captured some killer whales in the 80s, and Russia and China seem to continue to capture killer whales to some extent and sell those killer whales to Russian and Chinese parks. As far as I could tell, the last captured orca at a SeaWorld park was captured in 1983, and that orca was acquired from a Canadian aquarium. So that's the last time a captured orca ended up at a SeaWorld park. All other surviving orcas in the SeaWorld parks are captive bred, and we'll talk a little bit about SeaWorld's breeding program. But not extensively. The third SeaWorld park is probably the best known for most of us East Coasters, and that's SeaWorld Orlando. You know that Walt Disney World had opened in 1971, which made Orlando suddenly attractive, and SeaWorld sprung out and built their park just a couple of years later in 1973, which of course is still open. And SeaWorld's opening just after Walt Disney World's Magic Kingdom. Incidentally, I'm recording this on Friday, and it happens to be this just happens to be the 50th anniversary of Walt Disney World's opening. Today, October 1st, is the 50th anniversary of Magic Kingdom's opening. at the Walt Disney World Resort. So the fact that SeaWorld moved there so soon, becoming the first other major theme park to land in Orlando after Magic Kingdom, helps solidify Orlando as a tourist destination. And over the years, SeaWorld has gone from direct competitor with Walt Disney World to also ran, depending on their fortunes. So over the years, sometimes SeaWorld has done very well, and they've charged premium prices because it's a nice park, and they're able to compete directly with the Walt Disney attractions. And other times, SeaWorld has fallen on hard times, and they've had to lower their prices because they're not doing so well, and they have to kind of admit that they're not a premium world-class park to visit. That they're probably in that category these days, and there are reasons for that. Probably the main reason for that these days is the fact that they do not have a giant parent company that with deep pockets to help keep the park amazing. SeaWorld no longer has a giant corporate parent as they used to. These days, it tends to market itself as a discount park relative to the Disney parks, the destination parks like Disney and Universal. Okay, so here's something weird that happens. A publisher in New York, Harcourt Brace Jovanovich, buys SeaWorld. This is in 1977, so it's 4 years after they opened their third park in Orlando, Florida. And does this seem weird to you? Yeah, because it is weird, but back in the 70s and the 80s, it was not that uncommon for companies to enter into industries where they had no business entering. But we called them conglomerates. So there were companies that would just get into all kinds of different businesses, even if that wasn't their core business. This Harcourt was obviously a publisher, and here they were getting into the business of theme parks. Sounds strange? Yeah, it is. But I can, if you didn't know that Sheraton Hotels used to own Wonder Bread. Well, they used to be part of the same company. That's the kind of stuff that went on. And we can, you can look up conglomerate and some of the weirdest examples of conglomerates if you like. When Harcourt actually was stepping in as a white knight. If you remember from finance and accounting, a white knight is when a company is being taken over in a hostile takeover, and you don't want to be taken over by that company because they're going to take over your company and fire you. Sometimes you look for another buyer who will take over your company instead and leave you with your job if you're the CEO. And so at this time, MCA Universal was trying to buy SeaWorld. MCA Universal, of course, was already in the theme park business because they owned Universal Studios in Hollywood, and they felt that if they could compete with Disneyland in the LA area, then they could also compete with Disney World in Orlando. And so they really wanted that footprint in Orlando, and they made a bid to buy SeaWorld, but they were outbid by this white knight. So Harcourt buys SeaWorld for about $50 million. And again, I made this point already. This was a time of conglomerates, and Harcourt had already branched out of publishing into insurance and communications, so they go all in to the theme park thing. They even move their corporate headquarters to Orlando, and they don't stop there. With SeaWorld, they also go ahead and buy Cypress Gardens and Geauga Lake. So there we are. So Cypress Gardens. Oh, I don't have a picture of Cypress Gardens. So they bought Cypress Gardens was another theme park in Florida, an older one, actually older than Busch Gardens. And of course, Geauga Lake, they also bought that in 1985. They keep going. They announce SeaWorld, new SeaWorld in Texas that year in 1985. And they also buy two more Florida. They also buy another Florida theme park which was Circus World. So Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus had this kind of visitors theme park, and they sell to Harcourt, and Harcourt changes the name to Boardwalk and Baseball. I think they had a minor league baseball field there and some roller coasters. I've always known about Boardwalk and Baseball and that it was used to be Circus World, but I've never actually done the research on Boardwalk and Baseball to see what they had. All I know is there are roller coasters that I couldn't get there. This was the time when they had the Shamu blimp, which is sort of interesting. And even during this time, Harcourt still is expanding in the publishing industry, and it's one of the biggest, definitely one of the biggest publishers in the United States by this time. Harcourt Brace Jovanovich had acquired all of these theme parks and entertainment properties, but it was a Wild West time of mergers and acquisitions, because companies started realizing, they can go into debt, basically use debt to junk bonds were the thing, and companies started using debt to make mergers and acquisitions. And what happens is that Harcourt ends up getting a hostile takeover bid from another publisher, a smaller company. But Harcourt does something very interesting. They basically throw money at shareholders and use debt to finance throwing the money at shareholders. And by doing that, the shareholders reject the takeover bid because of they're getting cash. So essentially, the company changed from a high equity, low debt to low equity, high debt. And this will have an impact because HBJ will have a huge debt to service. Now, in the meantime, the company does build its fourth SeaWorld in San Antonio. They announced it in 1985. It opens in 1988, and it opened with a big hurrah. There was a huge publicity campaign. There were entertainment stars doing TV specials, that kind of thing. Huge attendance numbers. The park did very well. San Antonio was growing. San Antonio was enjoying a tourist boom, and the opening of the new SeaWorld in San Antonio, SeaWorld, Texas, did wonders for the local tourism industry, for hotel occupancy rates. You can see they did a partnership with Southwest Airlines, and Southwest started painting their airplanes to look like Shamu. Unfortunately for HBJ, the Piper had come to call. So in spite of the parks were doing well, but the company had so much debt from the takeover that they do a bunch of belt tightening in the late 80s. And eventually, though, and you can see that SeaWorld of Texas had the highest number of layoffs. And, that was partly because they had, you always have these extra workers when you're constructing the park and getting operations going. So they went through this belt tightening round, but it wasn't enough. And ultimately, Harcourt Brace Jovanovich had to put SeaWorld up for sale. So they had bought the parks back in... Sorry, I've got to go backwards here. They had bought the parks back in 1977. So in 1989, they say that we need to get rid of these assets. And who steps up to the plate to buy SeaWorld, the SeaWorld entertainment parks? It's none other than Anheuser-Busch. Anheuser-Busch. They were already in the theme parks business, as we've said, because they had the Busch parks, but they weren't the only bidders when HBJ put these up for sale. MCA, the owners of Universal Studios, again, for the second time, tried to buy SeaWorld because they still wanted that. They still wanted that to be able to compete with Disney in Orlando. So MCA had made a bid, and the then owners of Six Flags, a company called Westray, also put in a bid for SeaWorld. And even a group of executives that were led by the original SeaWorld founder, George Millay, they put in a bid. But ultimately, the winning bid was put in by Busch, Busch Entertainment, a subsidiary of Anheuser-Busch. They already owned the two Busch Gardens. They owned the Tampa water park known as Adventure Island and Sesame Place in Pennsylvania. And it looks like I have some extra text there because other bidders included is already above. The price for SeaWorld, $1.1 billion. And Anheuser-Busch would own SeaWorld for the rest of its natural life. And unfortunately for them, it wasn't, that natural life wasn't too much, not much longer. Well, I don't mean to be mean about it. I should also note that, over the time, SeaWorld was being criticized for having orcas in captivity, for doing the shows. And so occasionally animal activists would protest. Occasionally there would be, letters to the editor saying that SeaWorld was unethical and so on. As I said, by this time, actually going out and capturing orcas in the wild was no longer legal, but there's still an international trade going on. Of course, SeaWorld has a breeding program, so they're presumably getting their whales in a legitimate way, but there's still deep criticism. And in 1993, the film Free Willy comes out, and this again sparks activism against SeaWorld. If you've seen the movie, I saw it a while ago. I didn't see it when it came out in theaters, but essentially it's an abused whale in a rundown theme park, who befriends a boy, and I guess the boy helps the whale escape into the ocean. And there was it was based on a real whale who actually was freed in real life, although that story is a whole nother saga. At the same time, Anheuser-Busch was claiming to they were claiming that they were actually conservationists, that they did care about the natural environment. That was the argument they made, that their animal husbandry skills and arts were extremely good and effective. That it was one of those things like, believe me, you wish you could live as well as those whales, the whales in at SeaWorld. And they also started pushing the rescue storyline, where SeaWorld would go out and take in injured otters and seals that were malnourished and manatees that had been hit by propellers on boats, and they would rescue these animals. And the Busch family itself really prided itself on its natural on its care for animals. And I think August Busch III's daughter was one of these animal ambassadors at the SeaWorld parks. So they basically said, we're like a zoo, and all the things that we think are good about zoos, that's what we do. We care about the natural environment. So when Anheuser-Busch owns the parks, they look great. They're as I mentioned before, I think the the landscape architecture was gorgeous. The parks were clean. Really the SeaWorld parks. This was a time when SeaWorld can really compete with Disney head to head. We're talking about the late '80s and '90s. SeaWorld and Orlando can compete head to head because they do have a big company behind them with deep pockets that can make sure things are nice and fancy. And the Budweiser Clydesdales could be found in all of the theme parks, and you could see actually they gave away free beer. I think SeaWorld employees would get free beer because that was a policy of Anheuser-Busch that every employee could get a certain amount of free beer. So that included the SeaWorld employees. And, it was a big thing, in St. Louis. So you'd have SeaWorld night at Cardinals games. The Anheuser-Busch owned the St. Louis Cardinals from the 50s through the 90s. So it made sense for them to, sort of put together, the two big brand properties that they had. And Anheuser-Busch would hold its annual shareholders meeting, at SeaWorld. So it was actually a big part of the whole Busch Gardens and Busch Entertainment and SeaWorld thing was a part of the Busch family identity, and the Busch family was in control of the management of the park. We said that HBJ had built the SeaWorld Texas park. Well, Anheuser-Busch also added a park to the SeaWorld chain, built it from scratch. Not a big park. It's a small park. It's Discovery Cove. And these are recent pictures from the Discovery Cove website. But it's a boutique theme park. It's sort of like it is the boutique theme park, and you get to swim with here are the things that come on: swim with the dolphins, unlimited food and drink, white sand beaches and tropical lagoons, wetsuits and snorkel gear, snorkeling with fish and rays, hand feed tropical birds, up close animal encounters, winding rivers and waterfalls, sunscreen and towels, all for free. For free. This is what's included. So here's some differential pricing, as you can see. So a weekend in October, at the beginning of October, is $299 a person, and then the cheapest one-day ticket at Discovery Cove is $224, and there are all these add-ons also. So if you want to swim with sharks, that costs extra, and if you want to do this sort of diving bell thing, that costs extra. But anyway, this park, Discovery Cove, adjacent to it's in Orlando, was built by Anheuser-Busch, announced in '98, and it opened in 2000. Now that we've gotten to 2000, one of the most important events in 21st century, turn of the century tourism occurs, which of course is 9/11, and 9/11 really has a negative impact on global tourism, on domestic tourism. It lasts for a few years, but it's significant. It's acute. I think I remember President Bush going to Orlando after a couple of years after 9/11, and basically exhorting the country to start traveling again and go visit Disney World. And it hurt hotels, it hurt rental car companies. I mean, in some ways it was like COVID, although COVID was a bigger impact, I think. But around this time, in honor of first responders, SeaWorld starts giving free entry to police, fire, and emergency workers, and that continues to this day, where SeaWorld still has policies of free, lots of theme parks have reduced admissions, and SeaWorld sort of, I think, started the trend by trying to treat members of the armed forces, as heroes. The next phase in SeaWorld's development is the development of the Aquatica chain, which is essentially basically uh, each SeaWorld park added a water park called Aquatica. They're quite beautiful. I've actually never been to one. I'm a little ashamed to say that, but just not a huge water park guy. But the first Aquatica, sorry, I'm missing an A here. The first Aquatica water park is announced in 2005, opens in Orlando in 2008, and in 2012, Aquatica Aquatica San Antonio opens in 2012. There had been a little water park there called Lost Lagoon, and it's replaced with a full Aquatica, and San Diego opens the following year. In this case, Busch had purchased a water park called Knott's Soak City, and this had been part of the Knott's, Knott's Berry Farm asset, park chain, a San Diego location. Even though Knott's Berry Farm is in Los Angeles, they had developed the water park, a Knott's Soak City at more than one location. So Busch Entertainment actually buys that location from Cedar Fair in 2012, refurbishes it. That becomes Aquatica San Diego. As I said, Aquatica San Diego is currently being rethemed and redone to be another Sesame Place with a water park, but this time on the West Coast. So as we said back in '89, Anheuser-Busch buys SeaWorld from Harcourt Brace Jovanovich, and then the unthinkable happens, and Anheuser-Busch is acquired in a hostile takeover. I read this book about it, some years ago, and it's a great story. It's a weird family, the Busch family, but the long story short, the Busch family really treated the company as its own sort of personal company. Like, they had started the company, they had always run the company, and they put the family first, let's say. So they didn't run the company as efficiently as they could have or should have. They had some weird family stuff going on there, like August Busch III was afraid of elevators, so every day a helicopter would pick him up from his home, fly him to the office building where the helicopter would land on top, and then he would walk down one flight of stairs to his office on the top floor. He personally flew a jet all over the country when he wanted to travel. He had built Anheuser-Busch into an enormous company. He actually threw his own father out of the executive suite when he took over. And then he didn't give control of the company to his son. He brought in an outsider, then fired the outsider, and then brought in his son. But like I said, they're giving away free beer. They finally sold the Cardinals because that was seen as sort of a waste of money. Like, maybe the beer company shouldn't be owning a Major League Baseball team. And a lot of people said the same thing about SeaWorld and Busch Gardens. Why is a brewery running a theme park? And InBev basically came after them because the stock was undervalued, because the company underperformed, and eventually the board of Anheuser-Busch, including the Busch family, at least August Busch III, agreed that this was a very good offer, and they took it. So they took it, sold to InBev. A lot of things changed. It definitely, I think it was a blow to the ego of St. Louis and American industry in general. Now, InBev is basically a Brazilian company that took over a Belgian company. So it's a Brazilian brewer that took over the Belgian brewery that owns Stella. So it was a Brazilian beer company and a Belgian beer company combined, but the management were these Brazilians, and the Brazilians were fanatical about lowering costs. Like they would all the managers would fly coach, which is that's a far cry from the expense of flying your own private jet. So no private jets with InBev. Only I heard they had only there would only be one secretary per 5 managers. Not every manager gets a BlackBerry. That kind of stuff. The Bush family was notorious for treating the company as sort of their own private playground, and InBev was coming to cut costs to the bone. And it wasn't surprising that it would if you had said to somebody, I think InBev is now gonna the company became Anheuser-Busch InBev, AB InBev, and I think that was just to soothe the egos, so that AB would come first. It was a bigger company, but if you had said to somebody, I think InBev is going to sell off the theme park business, nobody argued with that. So InBev did start looking for a buyer for the theme parks, and they found one in Blackstone. Now, Blackstone they're basically a private equity company. They're they've long been a heavy investor in attractions and leisure. They owned all or part of Merlin Entertainments, and of course Merlin is the company that manages that owned and ran all the Legolands. And Blackstone had also bought half of Universal Studios in Orlando, Universal Orlando Resort. So Blackstone knew the theme park business well. They didn't, they weren't managers, but they were owners, and they've done this with lots of companies. Like they bought Hilton, they buy Hilton, improve it, and then issue an IPO and send the company back out on its own, and they make a huge profit in the bargain. So that's the kind of what Blackstone does. They buy these assets, improve them, sell them off. So they're kind of like a giant hedge fund. So even though Anheuser-Busch had sold the parks, the new company was allowed to keep all of the Busch name and branding. Orlando sold it for Anheuser-Busch, AB InBev, sold it for $2.7 billion. They were allowed to keep the branding Busch for Busch Gardens, but no more Clydesdales. No, you didn't see the Anheuser-Busch logo in the topiary anymore. And also Blackstone did change. Well, they did. One way they tried to improve the parks was to kind of push SeaWorld to start doing like TV shows. So now there are these shows like SeaWorld Rescue, and they go out and rescue seals, and behind the scenes at SeaWorld, stuff like that. So SeaWorld started doing media like that, and that was at Blackstone's urging. Now, right around this time, a big thing that happens in the theme park industry, specifically in Orlando, is the opening of the Wizarding World of Harry Potter at Universal's Islands of Adventure, and this is a picture from opening day. This is just the scene in Universal City Walk of people waiting to get into the park on that first day that Wizarding World opens, and it's a huge blockbuster for Universal Studios. I think Islands of Adventure had the biggest single year increase in attendance of any major theme park in history that year, and of course Blackstone's one of the owners, and this really shoots the value of Universal Orlando Resort up. And sure enough, Blackstone decides they're going to cash out. The next year, Blackstone told its partner, NBC Universal, because Blackstone owned half, NBC Universal owned half, and Blackstone tells NBC Universal, Because you remember when MCA Universal kept trying to buy SeaWorld, eventually MCA Universal did build Universal Studios Resort in Orlando. Once they had found a partner, Blackstone bought that partner out eventually, and Blackstone had an option to basically they were going to sell their 50% now that the value of the resort had grown enormously. So Blackstone says to NBC Universal, "Are you going to buy us out, the other 50%?" Because I guess NBC Universal had right of first refusal on that 50%. NBC Universal buys out Blackstone in 2011, and then in 2013, so at this point, NBC Universal is owned by General Electric, and in 2013, General Electric sells NBC Universal to Comcast. So that's who owns Universal Orlando Resort now, is Comcast. Okay. Another big development at around this time, so around the time that Wizarding World opens, is there is a trainer death at SeaWorld in Orlando. One of the few remaining killer whales captured in the wild was this Tilikum, and this was actually the third death involving Tilikum. And you can read that history if you want. But this experienced trailer, Dawn Brancheau, is killed at a they have these dining with Shamu events, and she does like a little bit of training stuff while you're having lunch, and apparently Tilikum grabbed her ponytail, dragged her under, so that the cause of death was drowning or blunt force trauma. And you can see, I think, I don't know where I got this picture, but if I'm not mistaken, that's that's the body of Dawn Brancheau, and one of these is Tilikum over here, and you can see these beasts are enormous. These whales are just gigantic. Tilikum had been the bull and the source of sperm for the breeding program. So Tilikum fathered like 12 different other killer whales throughout their system, throughout the SeaWorld system. Now, this happened, as I said, in February 2010. So no trainer has been in the water with a killer whale at any orca show that SeaWorld has done since then. After she was killed, OSHA, which is the federal Occupational Safety and Health Administration, they told SeaWorld, you can no longer have trainers in the water with the killer whales. They fined SeaWorld. SeaWorld challenged the fine, but they lost in court. And SeaWorld challenged the fine. They challenged the rule to stay out of the water as well. And eventually, SeaWorld gave up fighting the in other words, SeaWorld was trying to get trainers back in the water, but they gave up after 2014 because I think they just realized that it wasn't going to happen. And the courts, when SeaWorld challenged the court, challenged the fine and lost the court battle over the fine, it was easy for the court to say, you had evidence because you had many incidents in the past. So the Dawn's death was Ms. Brancheau's death was not the first. It wasn't the. Not only was it not the first death, it wasn't the first death of a trainer, I don't think, but there had been other accidents where trainers had been injured or nearly killed, or whatever. So the SeaWorld knows that it's dangerous to work with large wild animals, even if they've been born in captivity. SeaWorld, on the one hand, they were saying, well, it was her own fault because she didn't have her ponytail tied back and it was a distraction for the whale. So they kind of blamed it on her, which the family found incredibly obnoxious. And the court said, and on the other hand, they said, oh, we didn't know, we didn't know killer whales were dangerous. So the court was like, you're absurd. SeaWorld started doing a whole, wringing its hands and doing a lot of reflection about its killer whale program, because they really, Shamu is the symbol of SeaWorld, and now you have, the symbol killing your employees. Not a good thing. So Blackstone, at this point, Blackstone does what it does, which is do an initial public offering for the SeaWorld asset, and so let me point out that, like, even though this stuff was still going on, Brancheau killed in 2010, people wanted SeaWorld stock. It was considered a valuable brand. It was a popular theme park with high attendance. This article that I found about SeaWorld's IPO and first day of trading doesn't even mention the death of Don Brancheau, 3 years earlier, which is kind of shocking. Around this time, a book comes out, and a film is based on that book, and that film is called Blackfish, and probably you've heard of it, even though it's already it's been 8 years since this movie came out, and Blackfish has a huge impact. It's not that the film has a huge impact, but the film is shown at the Sundance Film Festival, and then I guess Magnolia Pictures and CNN buy the film to distribute it. So Magnolia does a in theater release, which I don't think was. I'm not sure how broad that was, because documentary, not that many people go to see documentaries in theaters, But what really got the film exposure was going on CNN. CNN put this movie on. It was, I don't know, it seemed like to me it was on like 2 or 3 times a day. And this really had a big impact, because suddenly I read that book, but most people don't pick up a big giant book about SeaWorld, and I gotta find that book. I know I have it, and CNN puts it into heavy rotation. A lot of people see this movie, and as I've told you, SeaWorld had been criticized for years about having whales in captivity, and what was this time it stuck, because they always had criticism and it never stuck, and eventually people forgot. This time it stuck, and the reason it stuck is because now in 2013 you have Twitter and Facebook and social media, so Blackfish will not go away. It's on TV, it's on everybody's phones, so this actually starts creating a negative business feedback loop for SeaWorld, and you start to see drop in attendance, and you start to see things like I think SeaWorld has this like barbecue and brew festival. All these theme parks have some kind of barbecue and beer festival, and they have a concert series and stuff like that, and so all these big bands start canceling gigs, and it just looks terrible for them, because it's in the, every time this happened, it's in the news. It's another little poke, some more salt in their wound. And now at this time, the company is saying, no, our attendance is fine, and this Blackfish thing is not having any effect, and everybody's just like, what? How can it not be having an effect? It's like all over the media. That and I should point out that Blackfish, both the book and the movie, they really discuss 2 issues. One issue is, should you have wild animals in captivity at all, right? There are some people who don't think there should be zoos, because animals don't belong in zoos. They belong wherever. And you can make all kinds of arguments like, well, they'd go extinct if there weren't zoos, all that kind of stuff. So one issue is the ethics of, and we're going to talk about ethics and theme parks and ethics of animals in more detail, but that's one issue, is the ethics of the ethics of having wild animals in captivity, and the other issue is, of course, and whether they're better served. SeaWorld would argue they live longer in captivity, and naturalists would say no, they don't. And naturalists would say the dorsal fin is all flopped over when they lie in a pool in Orlando for their whole lives. And look at the orcas that are in the Pacific Northwest, like in Puget Sound and Washington. All their dorsal fins are stiff and upright, and SeaWorld would say, oh, it's normal. The other issue was whether they were purposely putting trainers in danger. Now I know, a lot of these trainers, they grew up living, they want to be in the pool with a killer whale, whether it's dangerous or not, right? It's no fun if it's not. So those are the two issues: that had they knowingly endangered employees, and were they essentially knowingly, holding wild animals as prisoner. So this starts to bug Blackstone. They they don't really want the criticism. They announced they're going to reduce their stake in SeaWorld in 2014. And they had already sold a bunch of their initial investment. And this sale that they were planning would reduce their holdings to about 25% of the SeaWorld company. They had actually sold a big chunk of their when they bought it from Anheuser-Busch, and then did the IPO, they had sold a big chunk of their holdings. So they didn't, they sold about, in several sales, they didn't own as much anymore. But the impact of Blackfish is becoming unignorable for them. Eventually, SeaWorld's attendance and earnings and revenue really start to become noticeably worse. So here's a picture of the stock price. The stock had been doing well in 2013, and then early 2013 is when Blackfish documentary, and as it gets more traction, you can see the stock price start to fall. There's a recovery at the early 2014, but then it just gets worse and worse. And at a certain point, investors sued because they believed that because SeaWorld kept saying Blackfish isn't affecting us, Blackfish isn't affecting us. And at a certain point, investors sued, saying, you're lying. You know that it's impacting you, and you're basically giving out false information, and you're the insiders giving out false information. So they sued them, and when that happened, the stock really tumbled, and there were other lawsuits. It became clear that the company was lowering ticket prices in order to boost attendance, and another lawsuit against the company charged that the company was basically abusing animals, and sort of the biggest ignominy is when you land on a worst companies in America list. And I saw there's this one video of little kids saying, we're not doing any more school trips to SeaWorld, until SeaWorld, doesn't have orcas in captivity. The CEO of SeaWorld resigns, Jim Atchison. He had been with the company for some time. So to replace him, SeaWorld hires this guy. His name is Joel Manby, and Joel Manby is a pretty interesting guy. He's a great manager, I think. He started in the auto industry. He actually, he got an MBA, and he ended up becoming the CEO of Saab, Saab, the Swedish, one of the big Swedish car companies. They don't exist anymore. When they were owned by General Motors, Manby was the CEO of Saab. Later on, he became the CEO of Herschend Entertainment, and hopefully you all know that Herschend Entertainment is the parent company of Dollywood and Silver Dollar City, among other entertainment properties. And Herschend got a lot of exposure as the CEO of Dollywood. He wrote a book about being a servant a servant leader, and he was also on Undercover Boss, and those things got it, made him kind of a household name and made him well known in the theme park industry. Um, at this point, the company starts pushing back on Blackfish, basically saying, no, this is inaccurate. Look at all the work we do rescuing animals and stuff like that. So they started putting ads in the New York Times and spending a lot of money on image improvement. Joel Manby comes in and he says, all right, we have to do things differently. We can't be the same old SeaWorld. We're going to have to pivot. And they start talking about putting in new kinds of different attractions. And what I like about Manby is that Manby finally gets SeaWorld. This is internally. It wasn't public until later. But Manby finally gets the top management of the company and the board of directors to start talking about how to take Shamu out of the picture, because putting Shamu as the face of the company when everybody hates you because of Shamu, he thinks we've got to do something radical. Now another thing that happens around this time is that another sort of there were years and years SeaWorld could not catch a break. It was just bad news after bad news after bad news after bad news. And one thing that happened not long after Manby took over was that SeaWorld had to admit that it had used SeaWorld employees to secretly join animal rights groups and environmental organizations so that they could get inside information, essentially infiltrating environmental organizations like PETA and stuff like that, as posing as fake activists, and this kind of thing is extremely embarrassing for the company. The company claimed, I don't know if they ever got sued or what happened, but the company claimed that as soon as the board of directors found out about it, that they canceled it. So another embarrassment. I don't think this was Manby's idea. It was, but I think that SeaWorld had a culture of stonewalling that for decades and decades, animal activists would say, you're evil, and SeaWorld would just ignore them, and that worked. And now they were at a time where it wasn't working, and they became desperate. That's what I think. At this point, SeaWorld doesn't have the big pockets anymore. It's at this point, SeaWorld can't compete with Disney anymore. They're an also-ran, and they start selling their tickets cheaper because they start saying, well, let's grab those. Let's start, everybody's saying Disney and Universal are too expensive. Let's start grabbing those theme park goers in Orlando who say that it's all too expensive. And so they started doing that. They really pushed the rescue program, and they still do. And it's an impressive program. And then finally, and I remember that day when it came out that they said they're gonna end their orca shows, so it wouldn't be doing tricks and stuff like that, and they said they were gonna end their orca shows, and they said they were gonna make the pools bigger, and this was basically tacit agreement, essentially acknowledging the criticism that they had ignored publicly for decades and decades. So I thought Manby was a great leader with strategic vision, basically saying SeaWorld can't be SeaWorld. The SeaWorld of tomorrow can't be the same as the SeaWorld of yesterday. And so I admired that. And they were going to build out this big thing that looked like, giant tanks that looked like the natural environment, like the Pacific Northwest or Iceland, where the whales had come from. And but unfortunately, this has to go through regulatory approval. The California Coastal Commission essentially has jurisdiction over SeaWorld's animals in California and their habitats. And so they put this plan up for review, and the California Coastal Commission basically said, sure, you want to build a new, bigger, better habitat and stop doing the shows? Yes, we grant you that position. We grant you that. We grant you that. But no, you may not. You may not breed any more orcas. And this, that then it becomes an existential choice. Are we going to have orcas here or not? And SeaWorld fights the decision. I can't remember. I don't know if they said only no. I think they said that SeaWorld's entire breeding program would have to come to an end. SeaWorld, they fought back, but eventually they gave up. Again, like, Manby hasn't even been the CEO for a year, but Manby, he just sees the writing on the wall. SeaWorld cannot go on as before, and they announced an end to their breeding program and said, we're going to pivot. We're going to be more like a traditional theme park. You're going to see more events, more attractions, more rides, and they start doing things like that, like building new coasters and things like that. Unfortunately, unfortunately, as all this is going on, fewer people start coming to SeaWorld. So it's really hurting them financially. Attendance is way down. One of the reasons for this is that when SeaWorld says, okay, we're going to not do orcas like before, you've basically alienated all of the animal rights fans, because they hate SeaWorld because SeaWorld has orcas in captivity. And I thought, when they announced that we're not going to breed anymore, we're going to change the environment, we're not going to make them do tricks, I thought, then even people who care about animals will want to go back to SeaWorld. But it's not like that. Basically, many animal rights activists, it's all or nothing. So either you actually free the animals into the ocean, and of course they're all born in captivity, so it's maybe not a great idea, or you don't, or you boycott. So SeaWorld by this point had managed to piss off the animal rights activists, and they managed to piss off all the orca fans, because some people love Shamu. They think it's perfectly fine to watch Shamu do tricks, and SeaWorld was managing to basically get hate from anybody and everybody. So it was sort of a sad time. Blackstone, as it had said it would, managed to find a buyer for its remaining stake. So in 2018, a Chinese company, a Chinese investment group called Zhanghong, pays $449 million, and they make a and it's worth pointing out that Blackstone had basically made $1.7 billion in profit from the time from basically the difference between what it sold SeaWorld for and what it bought it for was about $1.7 billion. So not a bad move on Blackstone's part. The new ownership was going to start developing SeaWorld parks in China. A lot of people in China. There are you can fit 4 times the U.S. population in China, and it's a big growing middle class. So they're building a lot of theme parks in China. So some of them are going to be SeaWorlds, and Zhanghong was going to pay SeaWorld a consulting fee, and so they start paying money into SeaWorld. But unfortunately, the next year, Zhanghong stops paying, so the Asian development agreements are canceled, and Zhanghong, sort of like the big Chinese investment firm that just went bankrupt or is in the process of going bankrupt today in 2021, the same thing happened in 2019, and the shares were given up in 2019 to a securities agent. Now, I don't even know what that means, but that's what I read. And I'm not exactly sure, but I do know who the controlling partner in SeaWorld is today. I'm going to get to that. Now, so basically everything, Manby is throwing everything against the wall to see whether it sticks. I don't know what happens. Something personal, probably. But Joel Manby resigns in February 2018, and you can see everything just got worse and worse. I don't know. I felt terrible for the guy, and I was shocked and saddened because I think he really had a vision. He really did want to save the company. I think he was a capable manager, but I think maybe he just got tired of banging his head against the wall. So Joel Manby quit, and he was replaced. So as I'll show you, SeaWorld has not been able to keep a CEO in the office for very long. And since, if you include Joel Manby, CEO has had 5 CEOs since 2018, or 4th since 2019. So an executive from Busch Gardens Williamsburg was named interim CEO in 2018 when Manby quit, and then a year later they named this guy Gus Antorcha, a cruise line industry executive, and demoted Riley back down to chief operating officer. And even though they had said that Riley would work closely with Antorcha, because basically everything that they've been doing is essentially more or less what Manby said to do, although the only thing that hasn't changed is they haven't really gotten rid of Shamu. They're not breeding anymore, but Shamu, I've seen the Shamu shows, and they're not that different from the old shows. The Shamu is still doing tricks. Just the trainers aren't in the water anymore. That's really the big difference. So they didn't really get rid of Shamu, but they aren't planning on a future with Shamu. Anyway, so John Riley then abruptly leaves shortly after he doesn't get the top job permanently. Now Antorcha, he lasts from February to September. What? So Joel Manby leaves. John Riley's in the job for a year. He gets passed over for a new guy. The new guy doesn't even stay for a year. He stays for 7 months. So he leaves. They get a new guy a couple months later, Serge Rivera, who's a hotel executive. He joins in November. He's out in 6 months, in April. And then finally, he's replaced by Mark Swanson, who had been with the company as an auditor since the Anheuser-Busch days. He's named interim CEO in April 2020. He lasts a year, and he was actually just named the permanent CEO in May of this year. So that's the state of things right now. But it was kind of a running joke that SeaWorld was running through CEOs like a smoker runs through cigarettes. Anyway, now why is this happening? Because the majority shareholder of SeaWorld is now a company called Hill Path Capital. And they own at least 35%. They're the largest shareholder, and their CEO is a guy named Scott Ross. And Scott Ross decides who's going to run SeaWorld. And so it was Scott Ross that made all of these decisions. After Joel Manby leaves, John Riley doesn't get the top job because Scott Ross doesn't like him. Gus Antorcha quits, saying that he has he can't see eye to eye with the board. That means Scott Ross. Then Serge Rivera joins. He also leaves, saying that he can't see eye to eye with the board. That means Scott Ross. So finally we have Mark Swanson is the new CEO, and presumably he's going to do Scott Ross's bidding. So that explains why SeaWorld has been running through CEOs. So this brings us to our final slide, and right now SeaWorld is basically back. They are doing very well. Attendance is good. The company is doing well. They basically followed the game plan added a whole bunch of events. They they added events. They added rides. They really pushed the rescue program, and it's sort of rehabilitated their image to a degree. Uh, in addition, Blackfish came out in 2013, so now it's 8 years since Blackfish came out, so it's not quite as on people's minds as before. Whoops, there's a misspelling. It should be climbed. Attendance and revenue have improved over time. They are still in development, have development plans for foreign parks, and I believe they are actually in the process of constructing SeaWorld Abu Dhabi, Yas Island, and I don't know if they'll have orcas there or not. I'm not sure. And I was just poking around recently in the last week or two, and I noticed that the CEO and the chief HR officer at SeaWorld are selling shares. And sometimes you say, uh-oh, insiders are selling shares because the company's about to fail or something like that. But in fact, it's probably just because the stock price is high again. SeaWorld's stock price was so low for so long, and now the stock price is really high for SeaWorld. And so if you're an executive and you've received options, well, that kind of thing, Mark Swanson has been with the company for a long time. So now it's a good time to sell those shares. And that's true of the chief HR officer as well. She sold a lot of shares, although I'm not sure how long she's been with the company. Everything's not perfect. Last year, the whole they had SeaWorld had to settle with those investors who said you lied to us about how Blackfish was impacting your business, and finally the company had to settle in court. They didn't admit guilt, but that was a $65 million payoff. And right now, activists still don't like SeaWorld. I just saw a fairly recent editorial, I think in the Washington Post, basically saying SeaWorld isn't living up to the promises it made under Manby. And like I said, I just saw an orca show 2 weekends ago at the San Antonio park, and it looked like the old SeaWorld show to me, but without the trainers in the water. All right, thank you so much for listening to my brief corporate history. I don't know how long I've been going, but on the whole, I hope this was brief enough and interesting for you, and thank you for listening.